Good.
So
Yeah. It's nice to touch back into Bateson. Like I said, the only full book I read is Nature and Mind.
Mind and Nature, yeah, but
Mind and Nature.
that was a great book. It's just he was his attempt to vulgarize a little bit or
Uh-huh.
talk to the popular
Yeah.
audience. This one is a
Yeah.
much more scientific book, but
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
But I've gone back to that book over and over because I just like, you might say I'm a title horror, you know, Mind and Nature and then Unnecessary Unity, you know. Um, and I ran across Basin because of Alan Watts.
yeah, yeah. I don't think that was my reference, but it might have gone the other way. Hey.
Yeah. Well, I think they both hung out together for at times at Big Sur because of
Yes, yeah, they were at. He was a big stir. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and yeah, just um, especially the last before Armos, that the last part of her section where she's really saying how art can be helpful for science as far as looking at multiple perspectives simultaneously.
Yeah. So much of my work is on that is on bridging the the
Uh-huh.
divide between art and science. So I'm
Right.
writing papers about it, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's nice to see somebody, and she has a very sort of astute way of arguing it because it's not an easy argument to make normally. People
No.
think they're completely different things, and you're just ridiculous to even try to bridge the gap. Or
Yeah.
people work in one and then they dip into the other, and they don't really look at a proper,
Yeah, and
So
that's what I like about her father and her because they really broaden it out,
yeah,
and they actually seem to, for mine, it feels like it's almost like I'm visualizing the bridge that they're building,
yeah.
you know.
And I always get this whenever I reread Bateson. I realize how much of my career was actually
No kidding.
sat on top of his thought.
Oh
Things that
my.
I thought I invented, I realize now were Bateson, and I read it and I just absorbed it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've got a few of those as far as I've come to a few of those as far as the way I've been in finding out that the ideas I think are mine. No, they were seeds that planted that are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, you know, but yeah, I like her. I like this the subtitle of framing with other patterns.
Mm.
That subtitle to the art, framing with
Mm.
other patterns. And then in that last section, she talks about how much pattern is more important than, I forget what it was. I had it, but of perception and art and patterns.
And the poems are always interesting in her work too.
Oh yes, oh yes. She's
Because
not afraid. She's not afraid to share her personal side.
yeah, and well, the poems they're kind of halfway between abstract and personal.
Yeah,
Many poems are more personal, but this is they're not easy to read
no,
because they
yeah.
require you to step back from the concrete.
I
You
only
know.
read it twice, and I plan on going back and reading it again. So,
And it's nice. It was nice
uh,
to go back to Blake, the way that she takes us
oh
back to
yeah,
Blake as
because I
well.
love Blake. I'm not a Blake has always influenced me, but as I've only dabbled in Blake, through
Me too. Yeah,
other
me.
people using him as a, you know,
Although these days I've been thinking because I'm doing these illustrations, and Blake was such a strong writer plus illustrator.
yes.
I now am finding affinities with Blake that are
Oh,
new
nice,
affinities.
nice. That's nice. Oh, this is one thing piece from what she said. Art can teach us the value of information that does not demand proof.
Hmm.
I kind of like that. Not that I don't think she was trying to say, but sometimes we get so proof orientated, and I feel this way sometimes.
Well, the science world is horrible these days. It's like I work in a medically related environment.
Yeah.
And they all say, you know, it's got to be evidence based. Well, the problem with it's got to be evidence based is if it's got to be evidence based, there will be no new knowledge ever.
Thank you. Thank you.
Evidence is in existing knowledge. It's not new knowledge, and you can't step off the track if you're just going to be evidence based.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, because that I have a cousin that's a biology teacher, and she, especially during the Trump election and stuff, and all the things going on, and people, you know, not looking at, you know, how Trump was just flying in the face of any evidence, you know, the opposite.
Mm.
You know? And she was always using that word evidence, and I actually go, okay, I got persnickety. I go, yeah, but whose evidence are you going by? What, you know?
Yeah.
I just got persnickety of trying to walk the path. I understand evidence is important, but
it is important to counter the Trump-like things, but
yeah.
You can't then go whole hog on evidence and forget everything else. It's like,
yeah, exactly. That's what I did with her, because sometimes when I had a counterpoint, I go, well, here's the evidence I found, you know, just kind of using banter. Fortunately, she caught on, and it helped our dialogue, because I wasn't trying to dismiss her point of view. She comes from a very progressive left frame.
Yeah.
You know. So is it? It's cloudy here. What's the weather like over there?
It's cloudy.
Yeah.
But at least the snow is going down slowly. So.
Oh, okay.
We've got 2 meters of it still lying around on the ground.
So when does it kind of slow down? Or I don't know much about your area.
Well, like they announced snow last night, but I don't think we got much. So it should be not many snowstorms left, but.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Hi, John.
Hi, John. You're muted.
You turned it off instead of on.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, John.
Welcome, Michael.
Welcome. Yes. Thank you. Doug and you invited me, and I went to the library and got the book, and then downloaded her book, Nora Bateson, and
oh, cool.
Did my homework as best as I could.
This is, by the way, the hardest chapter in this whole book.
It is the worst by far.
Well, you know, that's interesting, because I find it the most invigorating.
Oh, good. We'll let you lead this session. I started.
No. I don't want to lead.
Chime in whenever you want.
Yeah.
Here's Douglas. Great. I hope. Hi, Doug.
Hi, Doug.
Michael was just saying he found this an interesting chapter, and Geoffrey and I both struggled with it. I don't know what's your response, Doug, but I think this is, I had to go to my library and pull out a lot of books and do a lot of background on Lamarck. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is exhausting, because this is an old battle that has no one won it. Although
and no one really cares today, because it was so solved 20, 30 years ago, and nobody really comes back and looks at it.
Exactly. Yeah, I am revisiting this, and I'm glad that I have, because I scratched my head and said, what is all this stuff about evolution anyway? And looking at the difference between cultural evolution and biological evolution.
Because he makes that
collapsing them, which is a bad idea. Yeah.
Yeah, but he does make the link, and he says, you know, legislation is like genetics in relation to politics, which is like somatic.
Exactly.
And I think that's why it takes this chapter to a whole different level. It's just that he mentions that and then he doesn't deal with it beyond
I
making
think
it link.
I agree, and I think that what we are not wanting to appreciate is the separation between, well, the separation between state and church has been established. That isn't easy and has not been easy for humanity, but it has been established. But the separation between state and science has not occurred yet. And we're in the process of doing that now and realizing how much of what we call science actually looks a lot like what used to be called religion. And I think we have to deal with these overlaps between these, what I think that great biologist, what's his name? I love him. Stephen Jay Gould called magisteria, non-overlapping magisteria. It says these are different aspects of our natures that we need to keep separate. And I think I think Bateson would disagree. I'm sure that Nora would disagree, that there are enormous overlaps between science and art and religion. We can differentiate them, but we should never collapse them into science.
I have to read more. I have to read more of Stephen Jay Gould. My brother, because I've been working on this project on characterizing singularity, and my brother pointed out to me a text by Stephen Jay Gould. Even though he's a biologist, he was writing about the nature of history. And in his writing about the nature of history, he was saying history is not about the general, it's about the singular.
Exactly.
Even though historians like to look at the generalities, but in fact, it's actually about the singular. Anyways, it's quite interesting. So I sort of feel like I need to read more of.
Well, why I brought him up, not only is he a great biologist, great thinker on evolutionary theory, but he also was he wished, if he hadn't become a biologist, he said he would love to become an opera singer. And he said he wanted to play Wotan in the Valkyrie more than anything else in the world. And I find that totally charming, that this man said we have to separate art from science, absolutely wanted to be an opera singer before he wanted to be a biologist. So I think that you can't keep these separate. Bateson didn't, Nora doesn't, and William Bateson didn't do it either. I mean, Nora, I think, tracks the history of the family and says, William, who created, termed the coin genetics, was loved art and put artists perhaps on a higher pedestal than he did the scientists. So I think we're dealing with these kind of pseudo turf wars, actually. Maybe in our age, whatever this new age, integral age will be something that was different. And I'm just going to lead off here. I just have a few quotations just to sort of maybe put some of this on the table, and then we could have an open discussion about what you guys are coming up with. I'm starting with Framing the Symmetry, Nora Bateson. And on page 96, I like this quote. She says, "The understanding of how living systems learn is not mappable. Some will disagree with that, but the processes are taking place at multiple levels and between multiple parts of a system. And within those parts of systems, there are more systems with parts. And all the parts are in communication. And communication is not the same thing as a script." And I wanted to add to that something that Bateson said after he wrote this book. He continued to struggle. And he, in another book of his, some of his later writings, Sacred Unity, he, I think, updates his chapter that we just read in this current book we're reading. And I think this helps sort of frame, I think he frames it better here than he did there in what we read. And he's talking about, he says, the word factor was a word coined to avoid saying cause, and at the same time to avoid saying idea or command. You will remember that in the 19th century, there had been deep and bloodthirsty battles around the Lamarckian concept of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And this concept was tabooed because it was believed, I think incorrectly, that it necessarily introduced a supernatural component into biological explanation. The component was variously called memory, mind, and so forth, but I don't believe it was a supernatural component. It would seem to me to fit with very little modification into the general scene of biological explanation, though its fitting would indeed alter the basis of biology from the very ground up and would alter our ideas about our relationship to mind, our relationship to each other, and our relationship to free will, and so on. In a word, our complete epistemology. And he goes on and says in the next paragraph, I believe what the bias is that rejected Lamarck for legitimate reasons, but why Darwinism and later neo-Darwinism, which is what we're dealing with now, has been built upon, I think, a lot of false presuppositions. And he goes on to say, he's talking about information. I start from the position in which I have some idea of the nature of what I want to call information, namely that this stuff is precisely not that, a thing, and that the entire language of materialism, good as it may be for the description of relations between material things, reflecting back upon the things, is lousy as a way of describing the relations between things to reflect upon their own organization. In other words, the entire materialistic or mechanistic language is inappropriate for my use, and I simply have had to have the courage to discard it. I don't think he had discarded it in the essay that we read. I think he was still clinging to it to some extent. But I think at this point in his life, he has discarded it. This means, of course, that in my mental world or universe, I acknowledge no things. And obvious, of course, there are no things in thought. The neurons may be channels for something, but they are not themselves things within the domain of thought, unless you think about them, which is another thing again. In thought, what we have are ideas. There are no pigs, no coconut palms, no people, no books, no pens, no, nothing. There are only ideas of pigs and coconut palms and people and whatever. Only ideas, names, and things like that. This lands you in a world which is totally strange. I find myself running, screaming from its contemplation, and essentially running back to the world of materialism, which seems to be what everybody else does, limited only by the amount of their discipline. What I feel driven to ask is, give me a pound, a little mass, a little time, a little length, some combination of these called energy. Give me power, give me all the rest of it. Give me location, for in the mental world, there is no location. There is only yes and no, only ideas of ideas, only news of messages. And the news is news essentially of differences, or differences between differences, and so on. What is perpetually happening in the works of the most learned philosophers, as well as people like myself, is a quick dash back into the idioms and styles and concepts of mechanical materialism to escape from the incredible barrenness, at first appearance, of the mental world. And he goes on and he goes more and more into what the mental world could be about. Anyway, I'm just sort of appreciating how there's a lot of the invisible that's operating in our lives, and our aspirations and our desires, and are front and center of our attention, of our somatic intelligence. And I think I would have an ally here in Michael, that our somatic intelligence, not our genome, is calling the shots in our lived experience, and that there is an influence. And I believe this is something that is taken up by other writers, like some of whom we've visited, an Irreducible Mind. There's a whole chapter on psychophysiological influence, how they have case after case of how the mind can change the expression of so-called genetically caused diseases. People who were supposed to die of something, didn't die of something that was genetically caused, but used their minds. And this is a field called psychoneuroimmunology. It's about 20, 30 years old. It was started up by Candace Pert, who wrote a book called Molecules of the Mind. And I think she was a Nobel Prize winner. At any rate, it's not just for New Age crackpots, this stuff. There is a relationship. These are very complex, as Nora is pointing out. And, you know, I think it's somewhere in between. I mean, it's not like genetics with this top-down sort of giving commands and instructions to the cell. We know that's not true. The Human Genome Project showed that there are not enough genes to have created all this diversity we see, that there was something else going besides genetics. And that's where the field of epigenetics has exploded and is extremely interesting. And what we once were calling junk DNA, we're now realizing is extremely important. And because this so-called junk DNA is actually inhibiting or there are certain genetics, certain kinds of combinations that get suppressed by these, what we now, they're no longer junk DNA, but they have a huge influence. And this is where I think epigenetics and culture, what we eat, what we drink, what we watch on TV, if we use flat screens, our exercise, all of these, and the air that we breathe, all these, culture has a huge influence. Our expectations of others, the expectations they have of us, these have effects. And these can have an influence, not a cause and effect, but an influence upon which genes get expressed. I mean, this is obvious in some ways, that certain genes are not going to get expressed in certain environments. But it's not so obvious in other ways, like homosexuality. And the whole idea, this is very central to my way of thinking, this whole notion of genetics, that homosexuality is caused by a gene, that therefore the person who expresses this is not to be held accountable. Presumably, if he or she were to be held accountable for their own behavior in this area of self-expression, that it would not be appropriate. And this was the legal case that was made and that succeeded in many ways in overturning previous generations' bias and prejudice. But an eminent biologist like Susan Oyama, took that argument and said she's pro-gay and all of that. But she said this idea that there's a gene that causes homosexuality is bad science. And we should not try to create conditions for this kind of bad science to become part of a doctrine. And I think this is a challenge because a lot of people like myself said, I don't give a shit. I'm tired of this stigma. I want to, so you're telling me, she was a heterosexual woman, brilliant person. She's not homophobic, but she's saying, if you want to get your rights this way, this is a bad way to do it because it's based on bad science. And I'm saying, I don't care. I want this law to change. And if the law will not change unless there's a victim. That's the way our legal system works. If you can prove yourself a victim of something, then you have legal standing and you can bring a case forward and there can be remedies. And that's why I think there's a huge area between culture, law, whatever that could be. Law may just be a handful of habits that people like and try to promote, and what can be expressed and what is demanded that people suppress. I think this is, we haven't figured this out yet as a species, nor have we figured out what a species even is. Species don't have run around with labels on their foreheads and saying, I belong to this species and you belong to that one. There's a whole lot of overlaps. And this is, I think, some of the things that we've learned from the Human Project is when we're looking at the levels that Darwin never looked at, like molecular biology and genetics. He knew nothing about this stuff. We're seeing that this neo-Darwinian legacy makes no sense. I think it was Lynn Margulis who said, when she was in a debate with Dawkins about the selfish meme, which he popularized in several books, and it's become all part of this whole part of this capitalist neoliberal dogma, the survival of the fittest, and all this the competition is good, the invisible hand, all of these kind of metaphors comes out of this Darwinian kind of grid. And she was saying it can't be, because genes cannot be selfish, because genes don't have a self. To which Dawkins just sort of blanked out. He didn't seem to have a very good response. I would definitely recommend that if you want to deep dive into politics and biology, I think that's a really good one. Lynn Margulis, of course, I'm a huge fan of hers. I think she was a total genius, because she was looking at symbiosis in the very, very tiny, and at those levels, we're looking at how cells organize. They do not organize around a DNA following the commands of DNA. It's much more fluid. And I think there's a great stability that is provided by the DNA. Thank God we have it. But there's also an active component which we living somatic intelligences provide. And I think this is my 2 cents, and I'll shut up now and let you guys talk. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to reevaluate some of my own very fuzzy thinking. And it's still fuzzy, I admit, but I think it's, I think fuzzy is good. And I think this is what our friend Nora is saying. And I think she's responding to the fights and the big battles that her father and her grandfather fought. And she's adding on something to, I think, that family legacy, and also our legacy as well. So, because it's very fuzzy, this stuff. Thank you. I'm glad to hear you're all reading this and persevering, because a lot of people have dropped out. This is not easy.
No, it's not. So just some points. I can't find it, but there was a distinction made somewhere between natural selection and organic selection. And this is my brief understanding of what I grasped of that. Is natural selection, I think whoever was, I don't know which one was saying, is the outer influence that we have from the environment. Organic, which includes genetic, you know, in a way, is different, and they were taking the argument that should be included of what's going on inside, not just giving so much, like you're saying, John, so much influence to the external, you know, and natural selection. And that distinction first, I found that very useful. Another thing, you're talking about the law. I have a cousin, her daughter actually was a student of Jay Gould's. She's editor of a magazine called Cosmologics magazine from Harvard. And she just did a piece in an interview about how science and politics are so, like you're trying to say, so unrealistically influencing each other, because politics sets policy based on science. Well, you know, then you get politicians that, like climate change or whatever, or like you pointed out, they just pick the scientist that supports their position and then sets policy behind it. So it was a really good interview that she did and take on it, and that's been part of my influence as far as understanding your point about how much, I think I forgot how you said it, but these overlap, but it's very dangerous to not understand, like Gould says, that there needs to be a distinction or something, not without separation, distinction without separation, if I can say it that way. But that's hard for people to think that way. It's hard for people to think that way. I like what Nora was challenging, the metaphor, the mechanical metaphor, in terms of just the word systems, because I know even myself, even that terminology can flip it into a mechanical metaphor. And her, at least my felt response of putting living systems in front of it kind of helped me not so much buy into that. I found it interesting that both of them, well, I was telling Geoffrey, I found it really appreciative of how well she lays out her lineage and the influences from these two men that she was, and I didn't know that his father was the one that came up with the word genetics. And I found it very, I was telling Geoffrey again, how much art played with these two men, played a part. And I think she makes a case, the value of art, and I hope I'm saying this right, is to help work with the fuzzy. It's to keep an open mind to multiple perspectives. And because it's about perception, even before you get to science. You know, science begins with perception. And as a method, I think she quotes her father, is that it's a method to gather data. Don't confuse it with becoming the one and only way of trying to, I like this phrase, study carefully, examine, you know, bring a rigor, but a rigor that is not, I would say, from my point of view, a rigor that is not rigidified. It's not necessarily rigid. It's just on point, you know, and being willing to be open at the same time. And in terms of the somatic intelligence, a lot of stuff that I was reading, and it was challenging, and I like to be stretched that way, but it was verifying how much of my grounding in somatic of really disentangling my concepts. I like that word versus detachment now. Picking up new words. Disentangling my concepts, which are useful, so that in this somatic intelligence, what you come to experience is your body is porous. Like you're saying, John, it interacts with everything, you know, through many mediums, through our skin, through the messages and stuff. And I was having a talk with somebody else about how overwhelming that is. And I do agree. It is. Actually, I was having a talk with Mark, the talk that Mark and I did, and he brought up being overwhelmed. And I don't disagree with him, but my pushback against Mark is there are practices, there's studies to work that you can use that overwhelm as a push off. What do I do next? How do I relate to it? Rather than just, you know, out of a, probably this whole society is, well, you're overwhelmed. Well, best thing to do is go get a drink, go have sex, go do this, go do that. Not actually turn towards overwhelm and show yourself that you probably have capacities to work with it. And not only that, the overwhelm is probably helping you understand you've reached too much. You know, you need to slow down. Anyway, that's my vibe on it.
Well said, Michael. Thank you. And slow down and integrate something.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, finish your, but I want to ask you about that, John. Finish your statement. I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, great, because I think the challenge is, and I'm looking at second order, if we're going from first order to a second order systems theory, we're going to have to drop some of the options that we thought we had at first order, because we're not objective observers of separate systems. We are participant observers with other observing systems. So we're observing them, they're observing us.
Exactly.
It's much more like feeding the squirrels in the park than it is like, I'm going to tell you what to do over there. And I'm
Right.
going to make you follow this regimen so that that system that I'm separate from can benefit me the most. So I'm going to extract from that system what I want. And this
Okay.
is a colonizing tendency. It's a very modernist idea, and it runs very deep in us. That this is the way things should be. It's not the way things really are, but they're the way that our whole capitalist system, with its supply and demand and command structures, top-down, corporate-driven,
Mhm.
are going to want to optimize or maximize rather than optimize, because they're not optimizing very much right now. They're actually polluting our oceans and poisoning our air so fast that we may not have but a few generations left. So we're really starting to think about what is an alternative to this, you know, endless growth mythology, which is being promoted. And I think this is what I think we're trying to figure out. This is probably a larger question. But I think this is what Nora is looking at and what Gregory was looking at. And this is a long history. And some of the thinkers like Dave R. Loeffler, which we're now in dialogue with, he's looking at all the history of technology as well. And the internal shifts, the interiors that happen within ourselves and with one another as these regimes get, enacted. And I think what we do if we're in a dysfunctional pathological system, such as I believe that we are, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support that, and I think a lot of people are bringing that evidence forward. How do we create how do we shift out of these dependencies on fossil fuels, and which are leading to such catastrophes? So this is, I think, the big challenge. Anyway, also Cosmologics, if you could post that author, and because I'm very curious about reading up on that. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, because it's science, culture, and religion.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a very good magazine, and it has some really young, innovative writers and thinkers. Myrna, who is the editor, is the daughter of my cousin, and she's a beautiful lady, and God, she's so thoughtful in her approach of these issues. And that,
Well, I love that title, Cosmologics.
Yeah,
I like that.
yeah. But what I was going to bring forth, I think part of this slowing down, and this is influenced by my reading of Wittencott and his study of how, our early nervous systems have to deal with the environment, and like you say, our caretakers and stuff. And he was brought forward a holding environment that, in terms of that, allowing the child to unintegrate, in the sense, I think it's slowed down because a term that you unintegrating is not getting caught and trying to integrate so fast. I think this is part of the problem that I've experienced even in my recovery, is sometimes it was, I have to hurry up and integrate. I got to integrate. I got to integrate. I got it. I got to bring that. And this notion of slowing down resonates with that period of, it's okay to unintegrate. You're not trying to, you're not falling into disintegration. You're not falling apart, but you're just regulating. I don't need to take all this in as, hurry up and get it all in me and be an integrated person or whatever.
I just want to respond to that very briefly and let other people talk, because I want to hear what everyone else has to say. But
Yeah.
there's I would say not unintegrating. I would use the unlearning. We need to unlearn as we learn.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of a choreographer dancer, and she said dancers are highly evolved, kinesthetic and proprioceptively. The somatic intelligence is quite profound in athletes and dancers. But she says a dancer, if you're introducing them to a different style, they have to unlearn the style that they mastered. So you have to go, if you want to go from being a modern dancer to a ballet, you're going to have to unlearn. Or if you want to go from ballet to hip hop, which is happening now, we're seeing all kinds of genres. You're going to have to unlearn something so that you can then learn something else. And then you can go back to what you unlearned and bring it back in. in an artful way. But I think that's a challenge for all of us.
And that's a very good point. That's a very good point. I just think the issue here, just taking how children are forced to learn things, be overwhelmed with learning. And their learning is, get this, integrate this, you need this now. So I think we're both work. I mean, I understand what you're saying there, and that's true. But I noticed that for me, sometimes it's, no, I don't need to listen to your shit, in a way. I need to slow down and take it in. And so I think it might be a dovetail of both, if that is reasonable.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doug and Geoffrey, please.
I haven't had a chance to check in, so I'll state that I don't have my charger on my phone. Since it has a longer battery life, I don't carry it around with me. So if I poof or disappear, that's probably what happened. Also, I misread the reading, so I didn't read what Bateson and Lamarck, that I didn't realize how lengthy it was. I thought I lucked out and got a short reading this time around with only the original reading. So, but I think you guys didn't necessarily give a summary, but I understand where it was going. But I want to quote a friend, TJ, who just posted something this morning that goes right along with integrating things now. Right? He has those 3 words there, but if you read the full sentence, it says, "Yet it will take true openness and vision to fruitfully integrate things now. Among other things, to bring on a planetary awareness that goes beyond the soulless conflict management of globalization. For that, dreams will be essential." And where Michael just left off was the childlike qualities that need to be nurtured to a certain extent. If there's a forcing or that the demand to learn a specific set of rules or basics, or even what we geniuses here think needs to be taught. Everyone is smarter than, or perceives themselves as smarter than they actually are, or than everyone else in the room. Typically, I, as the individual, will be the one that trumps everyone else secretly in the background. And that goes for how the world runs. We have nice ways of managing that, but secretly we all know we have the integral vision. So that's where we need to get out of ourselves, get out of our modes. From my perspective, I'm not needing, I don't have anything to unlearn. I've never been a master. I've never mastered dance or even the English language or this or that. I've always been a dabbler. So I've got the integral vision to a certain extent, but at the same time, I can't excel. I can't lift off. I've been grounded for too long. So I'm just one perspective, and we each have the various teachings we wish to bring about. So I think these Bateson readings, I did focus more on Nora Bateson this time around, the essay, Art and Complexity. And the more I think about it, the artistic vision needs to be cradled. At the same time, it needs some sort of framing. So that's where my thoughts are right now.
You said you're a dabbler. And then you questioned about the integral. And you said, I can't excel. I think those are all that I can't excel and that I am a dabbler, those are all the ingredients of being integral, as far as I'm concerned. I think those are the prerequisites for being integral. The program, if it works for you, you're probably not integral. And that's where I think there is something in between the mental structure, efficient and deficient forms of it, and this new hypothesized integral structure, which I believe we're already there in some ways. Because I think
it's always just beginning. It's the other tenet that needs to go along with it is once you identify what you just said, you have to remember the other tenet that has to be broken as well. Is just loop back around to the beginning, and here we go.
I'm accepting your model of the world, Doug.
Mm-hmm. And I'm
just adding something to it that I think you, as we all have our blind spots, that's what friends are for. And I actually think you're very good at language. I think you could easily underestimate your abilities in that area. So I just want to share that with you. And I think this is part of being living systems. You know, at any rate, that's some of my intuitions about what's going on here about learning and unlearning and levels of learning. And if someone else has learned it and we learn it from them, then we can go on and learn something else or stay in that area of expertise. But I think this is the challenge in this trans-contextual kind of movement, which I think is another term for integral, or the second order, or the emergent, or whatever we want to call it. We're all calling it a lot of different things, but I think we're looking at these a comfort with the in-between and the not knowing, and moving between disciplines without getting too fluffy and getting lost in the mystery. And I think this is what Nora points out, is we want to stay rigorous, but we don't want to get rigid. And we don't want to just get lost in the mystery. That's not going to be very helpful either. So thanks.
That's it. Another book that's been, I just picked up recently as I try to dig into exactly what cybernetics was or still is. I picked up this book at the library by Jean-Pierre Dupuy. I don't know how to pronounce that last name there, but it's called On the Origins of Cognitive Science, and just happened to be a new book at the library at a small town that I visit for my job. So I picked it up and saw it. It's really about cybernetics, the Macy conferences, and how cybernetics became kind of had its rise and fall, is how he's describing it, and that then cognitive science kind of took its place. And I haven't made it all the way through, but Nora Bateson describes the Macy conferences briefly, and he fills in a lot of gaps and details. I guess the first few Macy conferences weren't really recorded, but there's a chapter in the book called The Limits of Interdisciplinary or Disciplinarity, which of course Nora Bateson had a chapter, a poem dedicated on, let's use the term trans-contextual rather than interdisciplinary. And I guess the author is saying that there were just too many branches in the cybernetics, these Macy conferences, that were trying to come up with exactly what it meant, and they kind of fell apart because they weren't seeing eye to eye, or were limiting themselves from within their discipline, perhaps. Yeah, it's interesting to try to fill in the historical background. It's not something I typically do, so I appreciate authors that have put books out like that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So that's interesting. You were looking for a good reference on the cybernetics. So it sounds like you found something to sort of fill your way into that, Doug. I got a lot of things to say about many different things that have come up. So I don't know. I sort of wanted to riff off what John was saying about your comments, Doug. People accused me throughout my career of being interested in too many things. And, because science tends to award and reward the specialists, the people who drill down into a particular area. And I followed Bateson, and I did drill down into different areas, but I only did it a certain amount of time. And then I jumped to a different area, and I brought the lessons from the first area with me, the way Bateson does in his career. I mean, in lots of ways, I molded my career on Bateson's style, if you like, without doing exactly what he did. I do think that, and one of the things that I noticed about the way I do things is that I tend to be, so I take on this role of the coach, not the coach exactly, but the what do you call it, the trailblazer, where I go into a new area and then I talk about the process of going into the new area with other people, so that other people can understand how you go into the new area. And it's a very sort of subtle and a powerful thing to do, because even though you are acting as the neophyte each time, you are allowing other people to follow in your path as the neophyte. But this is what you do, Doug. Systematically, you do that. You say, "Oh, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own process in going into this area that I'm just in the process of discovering." And then you talk about it and you'll share it with everybody. But this is a powerful way to learn. And it's a powerful way to share what one learns. And it builds this broad vision of things that eventually comes back out it finds its own way out again. That's why my comment about, I think that you're going to blow us all out of the water, is because the more stuff you absorb, the bigger what's going to, in my experience, it tends to come out again. So anyway, so I think you need to be, I understand being humble is also a good thing. We all tend to be have a little bit too much hubris in what we do, and a little bit more humility is a good thing.
I fully agree with that, and it goes along with the visionary, the vision of this site, the website, the vision of these reading groups that we wish to have, and I just as you were noticed in the vision and routine conversation with Michael, who led it, that you're a bit too critical on yourself, Michael, and I noticed that we have that to share there. So I appreciate any feedback from trailblazers. I'm taking small paths right now.
But we can also get very proud about being humble. So you have to watch. I know lots of humble people who are actually secretly extremely proud of their humility.
Yeah.
Ain't that the truth?
So to go on, so this first paper by Bateson. So this is an article, although it appears ostensibly to be about. Have I lost you guys? No, okay. It appears ostensibly to be about genetics and somatics. It's about biology. But it's not. Like everything Bateson does, it's not about. Yes, it is about genetics and biology, but it's also about culture and society, and it's also about ideas and how we deal with ideas. And so you cannot just focus in on the somatics and the genetics. And when I read it years ago, and reread it, what I retained about it is this idea of flexibility and the interplay between, so it's in a way, it's another version of what he said about habit. When he talks about habit and the fact that we have to take certain aspects of our everyday life and sink them down into automatisms, because if we had to think about them every time, we wouldn't do anything. So we have to build in these automatisms and sink them down at the level that it becomes, which is what he called habits. Well, these genetics are very similar. There are behavioral elements that are sunk down to the lower level, so that from an organism's point of view, they are kind of biological habits that are built into the organism. And the thing about the habits and these genetic structures is that they free up the ability of the organism to deal with a broad variety of things, which, if the organism is trying to adapt in the current context using non-habit stuff, like conscious thinking about everything, you can only deal with so many things that way. And so your flexibility, your ability to act is reduced. And so it's this idea, so it's this interplay between higher level things that get automatized versus, well, lower level things that get automatized, and then the meta level where you need to re-examine things and bring them back to the surface. I think it's the same argument we've seen in the earlier discussion about habit. And I've actually applied this in, for instance, so I've done a number of studies on how people with disability develop, because we studied things like life habits for people with disability, and the relation between the legislation of a culture and people with disability, and all of these things play into that discussion. So if you require everybody to deal with things on the top in terms of the politics, well, there's only so many things you can do. You have to get things down to the rights, and we've got a lot of the things about disability down to the rights level, and now there are other issues dealing with these things in the rights level, but it's still, so it's very much the same kind of discussion. So I found it extremely useful over the course of my work to think about this, not necessarily in terms of the Lamarckian argument, but in terms of this flexibility argument. Now, since our last discussion last week, I spent the week focusing on this idea like a mantra. I have a mantra now. My mantra is, people are overlapping fields of relations. And so I go through my days and I think this thought in my head 20, 30 times over the course of the day, just to remind myself, okay, next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to count to this person, and I'm going to remember that people are overlapping fields of relations. And I'm going to think about that. It's not easy when I'm in this discussion, in order to try, because I think this is the key. I think it's such a key thing. It relates to what you were talking about, Johnny, about Bateson's, the earlier work that he did here, where he wasn't an automatism, but eventually he gets to this point where he understands that everything is relationships, and he's built it into his mode of operation. And this is what I'm trying to do with my own around this, in this area. So, so I won't say how successful I was, but it did come in, it did change my thinking about some of the things I did this week. And so I'm hoping to see that continue in the next while. This idea that so the discussion in the Metalogue about sort of dancers, what's the sort of human. And so this idea that a sort of, in quotes, is a relation between ideas. So ideas of puppets and ideas of people, and relations between ideas of puppets and because obviously they're talking about the ballet Swan Lake, right? So ideas of puppets and ideas of people, and not the relationship between puppets and people, but the relationship between the ideas about the puppets and the ideas about the people. And this is, again, a thing that we get very easily confused. We drop the level down and we think we're talking about people and puppets, but we're not. We're talking about the ideas about these things. And so, you know, there's this thing, it's the map and the territory, the Korzybski thing, where he wants us to do a little glottal stop to remind us that. We still need something like that to catch this issue. And so the discussion also about sacrament versus metaphor, which was also in that text. So sacrament is, so he says, it's an undiscoverable secret. It's not something you can find, which reminds me of the book I read by Jacques Derrida called A Taste for the Secret, which is a lovely little book. It's a tiny little book, about 100 pages. It's done with a co-author, and there are 2 texts in it, but The Taste for the Secret is the one that Derrida wrote. It's gorgeous. It's the one that I use for a lot of my work on singularity these days. But so this idea of a sacrament, because Derrida had a lot of interest in the idea of sacrament. So from a Jewish perspective, as opposed to a Christian, but it was very interesting. Gregory Bateson. So Johnny, you said about this separation stuff. Gregory Bateson says, we ought to keep them separate. And then the daughter, yes. Oh no, then the father, but what the logicians and the scientists tried, that's what the logicians and the scientists try to do. But they do not create ballets that way, nor sacraments, right? So this is the issue. So living systems are not mappable. I outlined that same quote that you did, Johnny. This to me is this idea of non-representational, not representable. And all of cognitive science today, or 95% of it, is built on the idea that our brains maintain representations of the world. And all of that means that it's the separation of the mind and the body, and ultimately it's what's going on there. And if you separate the two, then you have to have representations of the world in order to deal with the world. And so everything has these, we have little images in our heads that we run around, and everything is an image. But the counter argument is no, it's not all about representation. And in fact, real life is not representable, which is what Nora Bateson is saying when she says not mappable. And so if it's not representationable, then perhaps we don't have these little images. We have some images, but we don't, not everything is an image. So there's a kind of a criticism or a thing about that. Nora Bateson talks about professionalism, which I thought was really interesting because I work in an area where everything is a profession. So in my department, my home department, it's geomatics, but the profession is apprenti, surveyor, okay, which is a profession, right? So they have an order, and they have a code of ethics, and they have, you know, so it's a profession. And then in rehabilitation, it's the profession of an occupational therapist and a physiotherapist, and all of these are professions, right? And the problem is, you know, there's a lot to say, a lot of good things about professions, but the problem is everything is reduced to a code of ethics. And there's no real thought, not always, about what the ethics is. It's more the code that matters, not the ethics itself. And this strikes me as neoliberalism to the nth degree again. Everything is focused on the code and not the underlying reality that code is attempting to deal with, right? And that's what the neoliberal culture has done, is focused, reorganize society around these codes instead of on the underlying things, right? So this is the argument of living systems is part of that argument too, right? So and the way that the science world has perverted the way of dealing with living systems, they've adopted systems as a code and forgotten about the reality underneath, so
Yeah.
Nora Bateson, there is no room for racism or religious discrimination or professional insult if we can begin to see each other and ourselves as multifaceted in our complexity. It's a very interesting quote, statement about, because about the complexity of being human, and racism comes from narrowing things down, not from opening things up, right? So, and those kinds of things. So, this idea that Nora comes back to this idea of grace, which remember was the very first, I think it was the very first article that we dealt with from Steps to Ecology of Mind. It's the first one he comes into. And it's this idea of what I've said as restoring grace to science. It's like the grace has gone out of science and we need to put it back in. This is part of what, so this is the integration of the arts within the sciences. I was talking to Michael about a little bit about my own work in this area, because most of my professional work is focused on integrating the arts and the sciences these days. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's not even an easy thing to argue. And Nora Bateson's arguments are very interesting for me, because they provide some ammunition because even, whenever I present this stuff, people are interested, scientists are interested in the integration of the arts, but they think it's a side issue. It's something you do on the side. It's not the mainstream of what science is about. Whereas, Nora and I and others think that if we don't do this, we're going to complete, the science becomes a travesty of what it should be, right? So, I mentioned, so I love the revisiting Blake, and I mentioned to Michael at the beginning that since I have started to illustrate my writings, I have a new understanding of Blake. Because he was very much a creative person who worked both in the written level and in the visual level. And I think that's part of why he's such a powerful, and obviously his poetry and his writings are imbued with the energy that comes from his illustrations, right? So clearly the two activities fed each other in his own personal makeup, right? So I think that's really interesting. Another aside, anyway, it's an odd thing to say, but anyway, whatever. So for my writing, I have most of my science fiction writing is based on Greek myths and legends, and I had up to today, I had focused on individual Greeks, like Orestes and Electra and Orpheus and these different characters. But I've been wanting to get a sense of the larger frame within which these characters operated. And I picked up Ovid's Metamorphoses, which I've never read. And, I just struggling to come to understand about what's going on in this rather unusual book. I mean, obviously a very old book, but because people say, oh, he jumps from subject to subject, and it's not easy to figure, and it's true, it's not quite easy to figure out what's going on. But there is a broader vision in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and the broader vision is extraordinary. It does give the background for understanding what's going on with these different personalities. And I think that's often not recognized by the commentaries about Ovid's work. And actually, it's giving me a way of restoring the larger frame. And I think it's related to the issue of science and art and these things that we're talking about. We're trying to restore the larger frames within, so the context and within which things can be understood. Nora Bateson, I have a small poster of Picasso's Woman Weeping on my dresser to remind me that to be a student of life is to be willing to be shattered. Yeah. And she finishes, in order for science to really work with complexity, we need art to help give scientists a more developed capacity to perceive context, one that includes all the disciplines, emotions, cultural symbols, and personal memories. As Blake said in The Grey Monk, a tear is an intellectual thing. And this idea of difference that makes a difference, and the importance of difference, Nora says, unity is not about oneness. It requires the process of uniting, which requires relationship. So that comes back to my people are fields of relations, which is my mantra. Oh, and final comment that I didn't know, that I had forgotten completely about. Gregory Bateson lost his brother to suicide as a young man. This must have had a huge impact on his life. So it's another really interesting, personal thing that helps place certain ideas about that would have come out of and motivated Gregory in his development and his work. So the way the personal comes into these stories.
There's another book edited by John Brockman, who did The Possible Minds. He's done many other editing. He was also the agent at some time for Bateson, Gregory Bateson. But he wrote a book called About Bateson, Essays on Gregory Bateson, by Mary Catherine, a few other people. But there's a short biography in there, which I'm trying to find. It's one of the few online books that I've got. But anyways, the biography mentions it doesn't even focus on Gregory Bateson. It focuses more on William Bateson, kind of the lead up. I guess it was a precursor to like an actual biography. So it's kind of notes on preparing a biography for Gregory Bateson. By David Lipset. I don't know if you've heard of him. He calls it Early Biography. So it might be available as a separate essay somewhere, but it's in the book about Bateson.
Have any of you seen that book, Runaway, that's about Bateson? Written by somebody that knew him, Runaway. It's a history of how much, just glancing at it, how much in the 60s Bateson's thought influenced the hip hop, political, not the hip hop, but I'm trying to remember who did Howl, the guy that a poet that did Howl.
Ginsberg.
But Ginsberg in that book says Ginsberg credited Bateson for having a planetary, bringing attention to the ecology of the planet. I'm gonna buy it, but it seems like an interesting read of going back of how he influenced how his influence began in the 60s and has somewhat, been very influential. And Gregory, I like your, Geoffrey, I'm sorry, relational fields, relationships, because that's an intuitive metaphor that I've been working with when I go out in the street and I have to sense where everybody's at and relate to people in the context that you're talking about.
So that's good. That's all I had to say. I think it was a big dump.
There was one more quote or mantra that you talked about at another time, which I wasn't present for, but I watched the second, I guess, the writers group, and you mentioned something, the turtle quote. Could you give that real quick? I found that to be very inspiring as well.
The which?
I think it's written in French, but it's mentioning turtles.
Oh yeah, turtles all the way down. Oh no, the turtle quote. Oh, I know the one you mean. Yeah, the one that's on my bedroom wall. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. I'll have to remember it too, but I wrote it down somewhere. It's a good mantra for me, but obviously not good enough to remember.
It's this idea that maybe a turtle is a rock that dreamed of moving, succeeded in moving, right?
Nice. I also I happened to read the introduction to ARCS, and Nora's daughter, her personal take on her mom and I really like this idea of her mom, and probably comes from her dad, that ideas are not static, that they have a life, and you come back and they're not something fixed. It's no some fixed, that I think even Bateson was playing with, of challenging how we want to fix things in static categories. And that's why I agree with you. I like the notion of the flexibility that we need to bring forth, even in re-examining these habits that serve a good purpose by going underground after we've learned things and we don't have to think, but sometimes we have to come back and re-examine those habits to see if they're relevant to where we're at now, is the way I see it.
Wow. I'm just going to, picking all of this in. I don't expect to integrate it in this conversation. I don't expect to integrate it in the next conversation either. There's something in between conversations that happens.
Yeah.
Just like we have the task in the relationships of each day that have to be performed with as much grace as we can, even though we don't live up to that.
Yeah.
Sometimes very clumsy.
Yeah, right.
and then we go to sleep at night, and we wake up the next day. Usually, I remember a dream. Sometimes I remember it. Sometimes I write it down. Sometimes it's lost. But I still think even the dreams that I've lost, they're still operating somewhere, and I will know that because I'll walk into a bookstore, and all of a sudden I'll remember. And I'll look at it, and a book will pop up, and I'll go, oh yeah, I remember dreaming about this experience last night, and it has something to do with this book. And I think everyone who's had, all book lovers who've gone to the library have eventually in their careers met the library angel.
I like that.
Where you can't find it in the system. It's nowhere to be found, but it's there somewhere. And then you put your hand on a stack of books, and you look it down where your hand is touching, and it's the book you're looking for, which the system lost. So
Yeah.
these are the kind of things that all researchers report, these kind of serendipitous events. It's been part of my interest is how do we make these happy accidents, how can we have these synchronistic events if we're paying attention to them? Would there be more of them happening? And I think that that's an open-ended question, but I think there is something that these serendipitous events and these eurekas and these discoveries happen to prepared minds. They usually don't happen to someone who doesn't give a shit, except once in a while. Someone will have a vision on the road to Damascus or something like that. But I think that's the, what I believe Gebser was calling the magical. And that's something that the rational has had a hard time dealing with. That there are these kind of eruptions that happen and that actually can change the course of our history. But a lot of these eurekas come from scientists, from artists, from ordinary, everyday people who just, you know, but I don't think it's the same as following your bliss. I think that's a truism that we get pumped up all about, and it becomes very narcissistic because people who follow their bliss usually are miserable people, I have found. It's not necessarily recommended. But anyway, I just wanted to share that because I want to compare some of the ramblings that I just sort of expressed and going back to modern Darwinism. And I'm quoting now from a book on biosemiotics. This guy is Jesper Hoffmeyer. He's steeped in Bateson and second order kind of thinking. And he's looking at Lamarck and Darwin, and he's talking about modern Darwinists. This idea of the flow of chance mutations coupled to competition among conspecific organisms is all we need to explain not only the multiple forms of life on Earth, but also the subordinate ecological and behavioral patterns that have appeared among these entities. That's all you need. Chance mutations coupled to competition among organisms. And he goes on to say, one may be allowed to suspect that the popularity of Darwinian explanations does not suffer damage by being so close to an analog to the dominating economic realities of Western societies. The idea that an invisible hand behind the back of the endlessly competing creatures has all by itself assured a healthy evolution of nature has shown itself to possess an overwhelming appeal to the modern mind. So I think he's just basically saying this Darwinian notion, especially in the neo-Darwinian forms of it, are just basically sort of endorsing this bias, this neoliberal capitalist bias that competition is good. And he goes on to say, I have suggested that the agency of organisms has an experience-like component, and I have sketched evolution as the perpetual increase in semiotic freedom produced through the semiogenic interactions of organisms. And he goes on to say, it feels hard, and this is no superficial feeling, not to think that the string quartets of Beethoven or the songs of John Lennon surpass the cries of macaque monkeys, or that the songs of birds are more exciting than courtship trembling in the watermite. So he's saying, I think, something that we all, this inner feeling that we all have is not to be ignored. And this sense of agency, as confusing as it is, it's not something that we can offload onto these abiotic systems, which AI enthusiasts are claiming is going to be the trend. And it's really, and it's a lived experience. I mean, I find myself walking through the streets of Manhattan, where I've lived for 40 years, and slowly but surely, I've noticed diversity disappearing, and it's being replaced by a corporate, what I can only call a corporate feeling. And it sort of, everything looks like an iPod or a laptop. It just has, everything has that, it looks like this, you know? And I think that, and the way it used to be, especially in the neighborhood where I live now, which was like a real bohemian enclave, it used to be really all over the place. So I'm using my body to sort of communicate the difference between this and is there something in between? Is there something in between this and this? I'd have to be a dancer to figure that out. But I think this is where, I think this is what our bodies do naturally. And I think we're doing it when we write poetry, or we're singing, or we're dancing, or we're, you know, rocking the baby to sleep. It's not going to be happening like this, you know. And I think that these are different kinds of codes that do, and we have more than one code. And I believe these analogical, expressive, active, participatory, inner feeling stuff isn't just woo-woo new age stuff. There's different kinds of touch. I've had direct experience of it. And it goes beyond the skin encapsulated ego. It goes beyond anything we currently in cognitive psychology call mind. And I think this is very, very tricky. But I do believe if we survive, and I hope that we will, but if we don't, that's okay with me also. Because I think at our current arrested level of development, it's a good thing that our species goes extinct. But I think we don't need to be caught up in the undertow of the arrested development of a handful of people. I think we can go beyond that. And I think there's ample evidence that many of us want to do so. But I think it is going to be a real challenge to use all of our knowledge, body knowledge, somatic intelligence, and to use you know, our maps, our capacity to make maps, and to use all of it well. And I think this is what, you know, causes a great deal of intensity in our systems. And how can we go from this discipline to that discipline, to this context to that context, and maintain a sense of stability and purpose when there's so many, and especially when we're living in systems that demand us to compete rather than to cooperate. And if you do cooperate, you're often going to be a loser, the way things are set up now. And if you've ever had the experience of seeing something dysfunctional in a system and reporting on it, you will find yourself often without a job really fast, because somebody's going to betray you, because they had a niche that they had constructed and they don't want you to tamper with that. So I think our systems are very complex, and they're driven by people who have inner feelings and who can deceive if it's in their perceived interest to do so, and they will. And they can be in the sciences, they can be in the arts, they can be in business, they can be in a family, or in intimate relationships. There's always a capacity for self-deception and for deceiving others. And we are communication systems. We're communicating, and we need to be very, very exquisite when, I don't know what it is about this guy. I just don't trust him. And how many times have you went along with someone where you felt that you shouldn't trust them, but you went along with them and you found out they betrayed you? This is a human, this is part of our human condition. We need to learn friend from foe. But we also need to recognize some people that we thought were our friends were not our friends, and some people that we thought were our foes, we found out are not our foes. So it's very, we get into these phase spaces, and I think this is very uncomfortable for most of us, because we do sort of want things to be fixed and stable and organized around that stability, and we fail to appreciate the aesthetics and that sometimes there's very unpleasant feelings we need to pay a lot of attention to rather than have another drink or start taking Xanax. Thanks.
John, I want to riff off and I want your response, because what you just laid out is really an effective part of how I move through the world. But the question I have, or I don't know how to phrase this, but it has to do with everything you described. From my internal experience, the way I've learned to work with the in-between is to know and work with the level of intensity. That's the beginning point to me, because the level of intensity moves to the uncomfortability, and we know uncomfortability is a gauge. And I've been working on bring skills of working with the in-between, what kind of skills I need, and intensity, and being working with the level of intense uncomfortability. Example is a simple intensity like yesterday between my son and I. We had a discussion about guns and stuff. 2 years ago, that could have really ended bad, that in between us. But I noticed that I took credit that I learned how to work with the intensity as it come up. I think this is because intensity, riffing off of Gebser, it takes intensity for things to grow, it seems to be, to move beyond. But now I'm going to tie the notion of intensity to when our nervous systems first come online. We have stored intensity patterns of holding against the intensity, and subtle numbing ourselves. And so this coming in contact with that in terms of my recovery was learning very gently, like you say, turning toward to show myself I'm not the child that have experienced intensity unconsciously. I'm an adult, and now I can work with it. So I guess my question is, how would you relate to everything you said of bringing forward, like a dancer maybe, or art itself works with intensity, right? So art would be a part of engaging in that artistic perception that I think Nora is trying to bring online.
And we've done these little workshops on occasion where we'll go into a metaphor for a resource a person wants to develop or a person already has. And I'll ask a few questions, what's that like? And there will be a metaphor. And then I will often ask a person to make a sketch or to draw it in a way that makes sense to you. It doesn't have to make sense to anyone else.
Yes, right.
And then you put that on paper, you've externalized it, and then you show it to others. And it becomes a communication.
Okay.
So it's not just an internal inner feeling. It's now something that you externalize and put on paper. And so you have verbal, you have nonverbal. And my feeling is, if you can't draw it, you probably are not going to create it. I think there's a deep relationship between what I want to have happen, my ability to articulate that, and to engage in the imagination. And then we can together create something that we want. Mm-hmm. And this is where I was saying, the gay movement, which I was a member of that movement, we were really good at this. And I can't remember a guy we read recently, a political thinker, talking about the ecology and politics.
Connolly.
We did a cafe on him, but he was pointing out what we need now is sort of like what happened with the gay movement in the 80s and the 90s, where people who were really up against it, and I was one of them. We pooled our resources and we mobilized and we used our imaginations, and we were funny. We were very funny. We had a great sense of humor, and and I think we used charm. We used a lot of charm, and we were very courageous. And I feel that that's something, and we had to move fast. There were theories and we did draw upon them, but I tried on theories the way I try on a costume. I put it on, wear it for a day and take it off and put on another one.
Right.
And that's where I found working with Bateson, the principles of mind-nature coordination, which I believe is what he's basically endorsing. That principle saved my ass on more occasion than I can. I mean, and I went into groups with enormous hostility, and I was able to coordinate. And I also, and I worked in corporate America too. So I was able to pass well enough so that I could function and make a living in a society which was very hostile to me at the level of my identity. And other gay people did this as well. So I'm just saying, we need to do that, and we need to do it better than we have ever done before, and we have to do it on purpose. And I believe this means, that's why I'm not for just taking it slow. And I'm going to take it slow and easy, maybe a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now. We don't have that kind of time. We have about a 10-year window of opportunity, and there's already stuff that's irreversible. And I think this is what we need to pay really a lot of attention to. And, I think we're going to need to use all of our knowledge, use all of it well. And I believe we have access to so much more in a limited way than this laissez-faire capitalist system will allow. And I feel many people who live with that lack of fulfillment because the system will not allow that or support it, end up getting addicted or, pathologized in some way, or, and I think that's the challenge, I think, for people who are very sensitive to these kinds of the in-between and these communications, sometimes very subtle. How do we integrate that? And I think that's a challenge for me. I'm not sure exactly what I mean by integration, but I think more diversity without integration is not a good idea. Just more is not a good idea. I think there have to be enough of us to do, I think what we're all trying to do here is, okay, we'll dive deep into some areas, but we don't have to dive that deep in every area because we just don't have time. But we do have friends. And if this guy or gal has taken a deep dive into that area, I need to ask good questions. Mm-hmm. And questions that probably they don't know how to answer. But that's how the experts and the non-experts, I can be expert in some areas. I'm going to be a non-expert in most areas. But I think we can still offer something to one another. But I think that's a transdisciplinary impulse. And I believe we need to do that kind of thing on purpose.
Well, and I am agreeing with that. I guess I'm just translating it through my filter of my first step is to deal with the intensity of doing that, because there's a level of intensity. I mean, even in this conversation with you guys, I'm being aware of an intensity within myself of the flow of the conversation, how I want to respond. And it's very, very much in my body because of just how I personalize my trauma.
That's
right. So this is my picture, John. This is my picture.
Well, a lot of the energies is flowing through us. Sometimes it's just too much.
That's my point. Yeah. Right.
And you can crash and burn. I've done it many times. So I'm not promoting that.
Yeah, I know.
I also know that systems our social cultural systems, they do not evolve unless they can handle perturbations.
Yeah.
And as people and as organizations change, they wobble dramatically before the new stability kicks in. Right. But I think that's the benefit of knowing something about systems theory, is that when things start to wobble badly, you don't have to go, oh no, I got to fix this. You have to say, no, don't fix it. It's wobbling badly. something else is going to happen that's much more interesting
Right
than if I
there.
try to fix this. Yeah.
That's right. Of feeling, working with, that's okay.
Yes.
Rather than the maybe old patterns of freaking out, because
Right.
we have
And-
past patterns of freaking out when we sense any wobbliness.
Right. And I think that's what we're up against right now. Most of our institutions are failing us. Let's admit it. And they're wobbling really badly.
Right.
And trying to create best practices to prop up these systems which are failing badly. We need to be able to, handle these perturbations,
Yeah.
and to guide and to redirect attention,
Right.
and to draw upon our vast untapped resources,
Mhm.
rather than try to stay in the arrested development of our fearless leaders, who are leading us off the edge really quickly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although I do feel, so you say perturbations, I don't disagree, but I think what's coming is the need for transformations, not just perturbations. And transformations are big and messy and difficult to deal with.
But I was just saying you need to register the perturbations as perturbations so that it can lead to transformation.
Yeah.
If you suppress it or try to block it, then I think you're going to create disaster, not transformation.
Yeah. And the other, it's like I read the Nora Bateson one and I go, we're doomed. I read them all and I think we're doomed every time. And then I get this little part of something inside me that says, maybe not, maybe not. But I do think, again, based on my own, so when I wrote this book that I haven't published in 2005, which is an essay about the future of humanity or the coming 40 years, in which I sort of suggested, well, we're headed for this major social change from the bottom to the top. But in 2005, the waters were calm. This was before 2008. And the drop in the housing market and all the rest of it. And in 2005, nobody was interested in, you have a few thinkers who were looking at the issues and being worried, but in the mainstream, nobody thought anything was, businesses were going on the same way they always had, and it was always, there was no serious looking in the larger culture that things weren't going to continue the same way they had in the same way. And 15 years later, okay, there's a serious awareness in the culture that things cannot go forward the same way that they have. This is a change in 15 years. Now, the change is not to the level where people are getting, some people are getting off their butts and doing something about it. But by no means the mainstream is doing that. The mainstream is sort of doing this thing, well, things are getting bad. They've always been getting bad if you really look on the story of it. But we're just going to keep muddling on and hope somebody else will fix the problem for us, right? This is the general feeling, okay, things things are being shaken up, but somebody will come along and fix it for us, the scientists or the politicians or whoever will do this for us, and we don't have to worry about it. And of course, there is a group that is saying, no, this isn't going to happen this way. If we don't do it, nobody's going to do it. And so there is a burgeoning movement, but it's still the minority, not the majority. Until it gets to the majority, there aren't going to be any transformations. They're just going to be perturbations, right? So, but looking at the timing of it, it took 15 years to get us. 15 years is not long in the cycle of the world. This is relatively quick to get from calm waters to a feeling of panic. But it's going to take, as you say, another 10 to 15 years before there's anything like enough. So what that means is that the ecology is going to get worse. The climate changes is going to become bigger. Everything is going to get a lot worse. The irreversible aspects of the changes underway are going to get worse because they have to, in order for the common person to feel they have to do something about it and not just give it over to everybody else. Things have to get a lot worse. Otherwise, they're just going to muddle on. And so, you know, there's no way it can't get worse. Then the question becomes, does it become worse enough early enough that the larger group, when it does get off its butt, can make the changes necessary in time to still have a world to live in on the other side, right? I don't know the answer to that, but I do think there are some grounds for not optimism exactly, but hope, let's say, on that. And all the work that we're doing here is a small drop in the bucket, but somehow you don't need a lot of people to clear up the way. You only need a small group that's able to do it, and slowly that filters out to eventually it filters out into the larger population if enough people are doing that. And so we're part of this early, let's say not say early visioning, because the early visionaries were the Batesons and the Rachel Carsons and these kinds of people who were talking about it many, many years ago. But so we're second wave visionaries, not first wave visionaries, or maybe third wave visionaries rather than second wave. I don't know.
Well, Nora brings up the subject of uncertainty in that chapter, and working with uncertainty. I feel this plays into holding our vision has that tension of uncertainty, right, Geoffrey?
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, so when I came up with this idea in 2005, it was based on systems theory, on Bateson's version of systems theory, right? And Bateson's version of systems theory at a very large scale. So you look at the curves of systems theory. So you have you don't have, I don't think you almost never have linear effects. You have exponential effects, or you have asymptotic effects, or you have reversals. Those are the systems theory. You have an exponential curve, but an exponential curve never goes up forever. It always eventually turns. But the question is, does it turn towards to reach an asymptote and stay at that level, or does it simply reverse and come back down again? Which is, of course, the worry. And the issue is that, from a systems perspective, when the curve is on its steepest slope, things are changing faster, but the forces in play are already in play. It's in the early part of the curve where you can actually influence things, not in the main steep part. But in the early part of the curve, things aren't changing very fast.
Because of momentum, right? Because of the momentum of the...
Yeah, because it's all about large numbers and things, right?
Yeah.
But it's a systems effect. So, and right now we're entering the middle of the curve. So things are already in play. But the point is, it will look always on the boundary. It will no matter what we do, it'll be on the boundary between failure and success.
Yeah.
It will look like that for a long time before it becomes clear which way it's going to go.
Okay.
That's right. We are doomed, and there's that little voice. And when we are doomed, and there's that little voice, what do we want to have happen? I think that's where our inner feelings have enormous influence. at this phase. But I don't think we should expect the Congress of the United States or the Parliament of Great Britain
No.
to come up with anything that's going to be that useful.
No, look at Brexit and the Parliament. I mean, a complete disaster, right?
It's a complete disaster. And I think it's something in between Hollywood and Washington, D.C. It's something about that dream factory. And I think that I think that's where the politics is always behind just about everything else. So I think it's the artists who get there first, then the scientists, and then the politicians.
Right on. I agree with you.
So right now, we're working at the edge, and hopefully there will be benefits that because we want it, our politicians will emerge and craft legislation. I believe this is already happening. And it's not just, the world cannot be divided neatly into the left and to the right, or the top and the bottom. There's a lot going in the in-between, these exaggerations. And I think, I think that our self-organizing systems is going to be crucial in being able to, I'm in this particular context, I don't like it. It sucks, but it's the only thing I know. So I guess I just have to live with it. So I'll just kick back and watch Netflix tonight. You know, that's an alternative. But I think there are enough people who say, this sucks, I don't like it. It's the only thing I know. Well, what do I want to have happen instead? And I'm going to have to come up with something. Some desired outcome. And I think this is what Devore was calling pleroma. I think you were there, Doug, in that conversation we had with Devore. It's that bliss-inducing desired outcome that makes me feel really good. So I can contrast and compare that desired outcome with this stuck state I don't like. And then I have to go on a journey through this gap that's between this stuck state and this desired outcome. This desired outcome has beyond it certain effects that I really, really want. So it's not just about having that desired outcome, it's about the effects of having that desired outcome. And I have to go through this journey. And that's where resources, perturbations, intensities, all kinds of shapes and sizes, our ability to work with concepts and percepts. We have to go through that in order to get to that desired outcome. And it's not just a given just because you want it really bad that you're going to get it.
No, that's the truth.
You have to implement some sort of plan, even if you don't demand that everything work out according to a plan. You have to have a plan. And I think this is the challenge for a lot of visionaries who just think, oh, I just have to come up with ideas. No, you need a realist there who can say, okay, that's great. Now, how are we going to make this happen? What's step number 1, step number 2, step number 3? And you need, my friends, a capacity for linearity to do that. we need sequence. That's very important, or we can't cook dinner. We can't go out shopping and get a shopping list together. We can't have a party unless we have those capacities to deal with sequence. Some things have to happen before other things. And this is, I think, the challenge. And we also need to have that critic who can step back and evaluate and press the pause button and say, yeah, I hear your vision and I get this is the plan, but I'm going to be critical now. And that's where I think those functions are widely distributed potentials. I believe we're at this middle structure and lots of people have these capacities, but I think we just need to coordinate them and use them really well and on purpose. And then we can start looking at our past. I think we have that desired outcome, we know our stuck state, then we can look at our past and say, what is it in the past that's going to help me? Rather than look for something in the past that's going to explain my stuck state. which is
Yeah.
what I think psychoanalysis is done to a large extent. But there may be something in my past that can, because past and present and future are fluid, and the past isn't just in the past. So I think this is the challenge, that there are multiple pasts that could be used to explore this current stuck state that I'm in. And it could be multiple causes. There's not just one trauma or two traumas or three traumas. You've had thousands of traumas, and all of them may have an influence, and none of them may have an influence. But it doesn't matter much unless you have a desired outcome that you know you're going for. And I think that's the challenge, is we just get trapped into our, we forget, I think, that we just say, oh, we're doomed, and we're just stuck and there's nothing we can do about it. So it's just hunker down and numb ourselves. And rather than just listen to those little voices, those inner feelings, it doesn't have to be this way. And we could start, I think, paying attention to what we want to have happen. And rather than get caught up in some narcissistic fantasy, but to just look into our past and say, what motifs can I draw upon that I can use so that I can take this leap into something new and unprecedented, and it scares me shitless. So I need a motif or two to take me forward.
Well, and so taking what you said and agreeing with 100%, my approach is, okay, how do I, in my day-to-day life, in moment interactions with the relational fields of everybody, how do I apply that and not, and I hear the voice of doom, but I'm going, shut the fuck up, I'm doing something. I'm trying to bring my vision forward, to be blunt, the voice of doom is going to be there because for a lot of reasons, but I agree with you. I just want, for me, it's about in my day-to-day life enacting that vision, and with a sort of, I know I don't have control, but it helps me move, not do what not fall into that trap you're saying about doom, and get paralyzed. But I also give myself permission. There are some days that's where I'm at, and I just have to work with that moment of being doomed, but I'm not going to be stuck there. It's just, sometimes that's the way it feels. I have to go to sleep. I have to eat cherry pie, whatever, and go to sleep just for a moment.
Well, that's an exercise that I've done. I don't think I've done it with you guys, but I've done it with groups. And when I was working with self-help groups for persons with AIDS, we would often, and there was hundreds of different stories. All of them were depressing. And every time you heard one, you go, oh, well, there is no hope.
Yeah.
But every time I heard that, say, well, can you draw a picture of that?
Yeah, right.
Okay. And a person could. But then I would ask them to draw another picture about what they would like to have happen. And then they would draw a picture of that. So they'd have these two pictures, the current reality and the reality that they want. And I would say, what's in between these two pictures? And they go, well, I'm not sure. I don't know why I'm saying this, and I think that's where we're looking at an alternate reality.
Right.
Under construction.
Right.
And that's where, when you say, you're hearing that voice of doom say, oh, shut the fuck up, I'm working on something. You're in that phase space in between realities. And I think it's sort of scary to realize how powerful we are.
Yeah, that's a good point, John.
Reality isn't just something that happens to us, that knocks us on the head or compels us to do. Reality is very fluid, and we are participant observers. And I think even physics, the new physics is pointing this out, that every observation is made by an observer. And so that's not to deny that there's an element of objectivity in some of our observations, but that objectivity arises out of certain ways of knowing. and certain kinds of practices. So I think it's a daunting, but I think it's also a great adventure.
But I want to bring forward alongside your drawing, because of a book called Diverse Practices, Diverse Bodies. See, for me, I agree with drawing, but I would like you to facilitate, what's that feel like in your body? Show me in your body. Draw it with your body, I guess I'm saying it. You know, and then contrast, well, how can you move out of that? Can you show me where you do? Because of our attitudes are ingrained in the way we move throughout the day. The way we move, I'm very aware of I change up my movements because it affects the way I change up my movements affects my thinking. And I'm very sensitive that when I feel like I'm doing like an automatic walking, I'm going, stop that, Mike, do something different. Because I know it's reinforcing a thinking in me that causes me to contract around and only listen to that dooming voice. So movement with my body helps me say, fuck you.
Well, we're coming up to the end of the 2-hour segment. Do we have anybody have some final comments to make?
I just want to say thank you for this, and I'm glad I came and attended. It's been very enthusiastic on my part.
Hope to see you again. No pressure, but
I'll do my best. I'll do my best.
We also have a great chapter coming up, Problems in Cetacean and Other Mammalian Communication. I think this is as I recall, he's talking about Dr. Lilly and the dolphins. And
yeah.
Oh, I studied Dr. Lilly for a long time.
Oh, I think you would like this chapter, Michael. It's very interesting.
Yeah. But thank you, my friends.
I might reach out to Lucy. Lucy did a lot of reading with John Lilly. She talked about, so maybe.
Yeah, maybe we could
not quite summer yet. I know she's probably still pretty busy, but
maybe we could try and hook her back in for the maybe one session anyway. I also want to remind you that unless you folks are planning to continue without me, I need a hiatus for a month from for the last week of April and the first 3 weeks of May. So you could organize a meeting without me in that time, but I won't be there.
So you're going to be here for the next 2, and then you're going to be off for 3. Is that? And we're almost finished, aren't we?
Yeah. I leave on the 24th. So how many? I think that I'm there for 2 more, and then after that I'm gone.
Well, I wouldn't mind postponing the finale until you return.
Right. Okay.
I think that was probably because you've been on this journey so far, and I feel like you're probably maturing some of your intuitions, and I would like you to share them with the group.
Yeah. Okay.
And also, I'm lazy. I don't want to be the only one who's reading this book.
And it's also very demanding, this reading. So I almost feel like a break is actually a good idea because it is so demanding.
It is hard.
Each week to do this.
Yeah. It's a lot.
It's a good thing that we only have one chapter more or less of Bateson to do each time, because there's such a challenge to deal with.
And I don't think I could do it on my own. I read this many years ago and very quickly, and probably recognizing that I wasn't understanding most of it. But those days are over now. I can't plunge into books that I don't understand and actually complete them. Now, if I don't understand something, I have to stop. Because it used to be that never hindered me.
You read such a lot, Johnny. I'm always amazed by how much you read.
I read a lot, but I don't finish anything anymore. I used to finish everything I read. I finished it. No matter if it bored me shitless, I still finished it. Not anymore. I mean, I don't have that kind of stick-to-itiveness.
Yeah.
And also, I think as you get older, and you guys might agree or disagree, as you get older, you realize you don't need to read the whole book. I already have read so many books that you only need to read the 2 or 3 chapters. So you don't need.
I still have the part of me that would like to finish, but he doesn't always win.
That's right. So I'd look for a vacation then, and to take a break when you take your break, and then we can come back together and finish up together.
Okay.
That sounds like a good plan.
So that means the last one before you take your break will be in 2 weeks, the 18th, and then we wait until you come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
So who's going to do next week? Do we have a volunteer?
Not me.
I was kind of expecting, based on our loop of 3 that we've been doing since we hadn't had too many participants. So I'll take the baton.
Okay. It sounds like I'm sure you'll enjoy that one. I can't wait to see what you do with it. No pressure.
No pressure.
There's quite a bit of reading on that one, I believe. Or at least it may not be lengthy, but it seems like there's.
Yeah, there is a bit of reading.
There's a lot of branches on this reading here. So
yeah.
And I do agree with the break. This is a book that I would not finish on my own. Not from the fact that it's bad, but as it's just complex material.
Because in terms of the amount of material, we've done almost 2/3 of the book. The chapters as we go forward are smaller chapters, but they're still very dense chapters, and so it will take us the time to get through it because the chapters are so dense. So.
And what I really love about rereading this is there's been so much research that Bateson did not have access to. So a lot of this has been updated by people who've taken his orientation and run with it and gone in different directions. And now we can study them. So we can see more about what his legacy is.
Yeah.
And the good news is that's on YouTube, all kinds of spaces that are exploring this stuff that we have access to, and which is one of the wonders of our technology, is that we do have access to it now.
Okay, well, good night. A good day, everybody.
Good day. Take care.
See you next time.
See you on the other side. Bye-bye.